let's go. 1, 2, 3, 4.
And of course, the camera one. Very nice.
There we go.
That should do us.
All set?
I think it's going, yeah. Yes, it's going.
Okay. For many people, when they hear the words nuclear power, they envision an explosion much like the one like this, depicted in this Charles Levy photograph from 1945. This was taken moments after the bomb over Nagasaki was let off, releasing devastating amounts of energy over Nagasaki, Japan. When I think of nuclear power, I think more like this. The 1962 creation from Hanna-Barbera, the Jetsons. Because I can imagine floaty cars in a city in the sky that we can be powered by clean energy and be able to do all the things that we want to do. Now, the World Nuclear Association shows that the United States is the world's largest producer of nuclear power. We have almost 100 currently operating plants. And even in South Carolina provides 9% of our electricity from the I01 Summer plant, which is just outside of Columbia. They are building 2 new units that are slated to go online in 2020. The World Nuclear Association also indicates that France produces 75% of their power with using nuclear power. In the 1970s, when we had the oil crisis, France made a decision in 1974 that they wanted to be more energy independent because they had very little in the way of natural resources, like we have coal and gas. So they created their nuclear energy program and have been quite successful. Not only do they produce 75% of their electricity, but they also recycle 17 to 20% of their fuel. So what's the problem? Well, there's 2 things that people usually think of. One, that nuclear power is dangerous, that it's going to explode like I showed you. And the other, that it creates perpetual waste. You hear a lot about radioactive waste, so I'm going to address those 2 things. The Health Physics Society at the University of Michigan provides an accurate description of how the public has been saturated with alarming stories and exaggerations about nuclear energy. Firstly, no nuclear reactor can explode like a bomb. Let me be clear. The conditions don't exist, the materials are not there. It really takes a certain set of circumstances to create that. At worst, the reactor core could heat up, melt down, but even that would be contained. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission specifies how these containment walls and these containment structures need to be built, and they're quite thick and made of steel, concrete, and lead. They're so strong, in fact, that you can go on YouTube and you can see a fighter jet flying into one at 500 miles an hour, and the jet basically disintegrates to nothing, but the wall's unharmed. The Health Physics Society also addresses the accident that we had at 3 Mile Island about 1979. Some of you may remember that. There was quite a bit of press, and it also sparked a lot of nuclear protests. You know, there was a lot of people that got out there and started protesting against nuclear energy. Part of what fueled that was 12 days before the accident occurred, this little movie showed up in the cinemas. So with that timing, The China Syndrome was a thriller about a nuclear power plant that melts down, and they said that it was going to melt clear through to China. And that movie just basically gave the protesters even more fuel to try to shut down as much efforts that we had in this country for nuclear power. So let's talk about that other issue, the radioactive waste. In the fuel cycle for most of our power plants, there's a solid uranium core which has all these little pellets that once a reaction is started, they bring it up to a sustained ability. Now, once they get that sustained fission going, it lasts for years. So you basically get the reaction going, you get everything set right, and it lasts for 3, 4, 5 years. Then the core is basically no longer useful. So they pull the core out and they store it in a pool of water on site with the power plant. After a few years, they can reprocess that fuel like France does, or it can be disassembled and put into long-term storage. What most people don't understand about that spent fuel is 96% of it is still uranium. They only burn up about 1% of the uranium that's in those fuel rods. Why it is taken offline is because it starts to accumulate these neutron absorbing materials, call it guck, that makes it very difficult to sustain a fission reaction anymore. So recall that, I said that France reprocesses 20% of the fuel, so is this really waste? I think it's just more energy. It's more fuel that they can just use for later. So what can we do better? Every time we build some of these solid fuel reactors, they get better. We've learned any kind of safety issues, which we've had very little, if any, other than the 3-mile accident that was very well publicized. These reactors have been running quietly for 40 years, and no one's really heard a peep out of them. And the other thing that we can do, according to the World Nuclear Association, is give some thought to some of the alternative type of reactors. There's one called a molten salt reactor, which uses a low pressure system and a thorium cycle. Of course, I could go into all the physics of all these. It gets very complicated. But with the thorium reactors, they've actually had one proven running in 1960s. But they kind of didn't pursue that so much because it wasn't able to produce the fissile material they wanted for nuclear bombs. And you have to remember that our Department of Energy happens to be under the Department of Defense. Mm-hmm. So in our country, there's a very close tie between those two things. So molten salt reactors are one thing that we can consider. Also fast neutron reactors, but of course those are the ones that are called breeder reactors, which are used to create plutonium for weapons grade materials. So if we think about it, nuclear energy has really been providing reliable and safe power for decades. And using more nuclear energy, like France, can rid ourselves of any kind of dependence on foreign oil. That sounds pretty good. So imagine what we can do with all this unlimited electrical energy. One of the things I think back to the Jetsons. This is the new car coming out in 2017. It is the Tesla Model 3. It is going to, it gets about 200 miles on a range. It goes 0 to 60 in about 6 seconds. It will drive itself, but it doesn't fly, unfortunately. The neat thing about that car is it runs on these. These are little 18650 batteries. It's lithium-ion rechargeable. And Tesla's actually building a huge plant out in Nevada that's going to manufacture millions of these. There's about 5,000 of these cells that goes into every Tesla vehicle that powers them. So if anything goes wrong, they just swap a few batteries out and you continue on your way. So I hope that my little talk here tonight has made you feel a little better about nuclear energy. I know there's so much about it that we fear it because we don't really understand it. But the physicists have worked really hard and the engineers have worked really hard and everybody has really created a sustainable, safe energy means that really emits no greenhouse gases. We have ways of managing any kind of byproducts that come out of it, so why not? I thank you for your time.
I have to scan the room again to make sure everybody's staying through.
Still here.